It is a national security issue for the state of Israel right now. If we don't bring back these people from Gaza and we let them die suffering in the tunnels, it will tear apart Israeli society.
There are 3 new books in English by 3 journalists describing exactly what happened on October 7th, the horrific invasion of Israel by 6,000 Hamas and other terrorists, the trauma of that day, but also the implications for Israel, for the Palestinians, for the Lebanese, and for the region, for the world. There are 3 journalists who have written firsthand accounts from their reporting. 2 are Israelis, 1 is American. I talked to all of them this week, and 2 of them you're going to hear from on this edition of Inside the Epicenter. Hi, I'm Joel Rosenberg, founder and chairman of the Joshua Fund. Of course, the Joshua Fund is a ministry that my wife, Lynn, and I started in 2006. Why? To bless Israel and her neighbors, to educate and mobilize Christians in the United States, Canada, and around the world to understand what is God's love and heart and prophetic plan for Israel, for the Palestinians, for the Lebanese, and others in this region. And how can Christians make a difference? How can we make sure that everyone knows about the Lord, knows about the scriptures, is turning to the Lord who was our shepherd, right out of Psalm 23, Jesus who is our great shepherd, the chief shepherd of our souls. How can we strengthen the local church that is living through very dark and difficult times? How can we care for the poor and needy as evangelicals, people who are suffering through this war or through just regular financial hardship? How can we be a witness and a blessing to Israel's Arab and Muslim neighbors? That's what the Joshua Fund does. And you can learn more about the Joshua Fund at joshuafund.com. Again, joshuafund.com. And that's the ministry Lynn and I started over 18 years ago. But never has it been more important or timely that this exists than now. And again, as I mentioned, one of the key elements of the Joshua Fund's mission is education, to help Christians and others, Jews, Muslims, others around the world understand what in the world is happening here in Israel. And we want to be a source of information you can trust. And that's what we're trying to do. And you seem to agree with us because your listenership has shot this podcast, which didn't even exist a few years ago, into the top 5% of all podcasts in the world. So thank you so much. And again, I think you're going to find this edition interesting. As I mentioned opening up, there are 3 new books just coming out about what happened on October 7th. And I want to encourage you to read all of them. Take them one by one. We'll talk about that later. But 2 of these books are by Israeli journalists, one of whom lived through and survived the October 7th horror because he and his wife and children live right on the Gaza border. So that's an amazing book. Amir Tibon, a journalist for a newspaper called Haaretz. You're going to hear from him in the second half of this podcast. Trey Yinx is the chief foreign correspondent for Fox News, and he's got a new book. He's the only international journalist, non-Israeli, who's written a book about this because he has direct sources as he's covered this war, and he's got Hamas sources that he cites in the book. He had exclusive interviews with Israel's defense minister, Gallant. So I had a chance to talk to both of those guys this week. Now, Amir, you're going to hear from on this program. Trey, we're going to have on a future program. But in the first half of this podcast, I want to talk to Seth Frantzman. Seth is a senior correspondent for the Jerusalem Post, one of the oldest, most prestigious newspapers here in Israel, which is also in digital, and it's in English. So that's useful, especially for me, and I think for you as well. So I want to pick up a conversation with Seth. He's got a new book out as well from his firsthand reporting. So let's go to my conversation right away with Seth Frantzman. Seth, thank you. I know your time is limited, but I'm so glad to have some time today you're the first person that's come on the podcast who's one of these authors to let me talk to you about your book. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I'm so grateful. So your book is appropriately titled The October 7th War, Israel's Battle for Security in Gaza. And I want to get right into it. First, how soon after October 7th, with all the rest of your reporting duties for the Jerusalem Post, and I know you've got a number of other things you're doing, how quickly did you think I probably need to do a book on this?
Well, I had been looking for a book, something else to write about. I had written a book about drone warfare, and I'd written a book about the war in ISIS. So I had been basically on the border since the first day of the war, and I'd been covering it and meeting with civilians that were victims and being down there on the border and seeing commanders and soldiers and fighting. And I guess after the first few weeks, basically, I realized this is a story that needed to be told. I had seen a lot of it. I'd been there. And I felt like to do it justice, I should put all this into a book. And people said, yeah, but the war is still going to be going on. We don't know how long it will last. And I said, I understand. But if you wanted to write about Pearl Harbor, you could write about Pearl Harbor, the attack, within the first year without necessarily covering the whole war. And it might be good because it'd be more fresh.
Right. Well, Seth, you're the ideal person to cover this war in terms of a book, because you're right. You're a Jerusalem Post reporter. You've been doing this for years. You're on the front lines. You have a day job that requires you to be covering this in real time. But you're right. As you say, October 7th is the critical moment. Yeah, the rest of the war is important too. But one of the problems is, and one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the podcast is because many Christians in the United States and all over the world, they're getting more information about what has happened since October 7th, but they don't actually know really what happened on October 7th. Why don't you start with where you were on that morning? How did that news break to you? And just play out your own personal narrative of how that day unfolded for you.
Sure. Well, I'd come back from the United States on, I think, October 5th or so. So the 6th was a Friday. And I got ready for Shabbat and, basically looked forward to sleeping in the next day because it was Simchat Torah. It was supposed to be a holiday. I live in Jerusalem. My balcony faces south. It faces towards a bit towards Bethlehem, but actually faces more towards Gaza, actually, oddly enough. So which is about 45 miles away. So I went to bed, and I guess, around 8 o'clock in the morning, my son woke me up and he was shaking me and he said that there are sirens in Jerusalem. Sirens. And I said, I just want to go back to sleep. I said, well, there are not any sirens. I don't know what you're talking about. And he said, no, there's sirens like for the rockets, not like an ambulance. So I got out of bed, and then as I kind of made my way out of the room, I could hear that wailing that is, very, very, something anyone in Israel knows what that sound means. So
true, but in Jerusalem, as you would say, right? Like we only hear it on Memorial Day or the Holocaust Memorial Day when we know at 10 o'clock, they're going to do the siren, but we don't hear it normally. Rockets normally don't reach Jerusalem.
Right. Generally, in the last few wars, I think in 2012, 2014, there had been some rockets fired in Jerusalem, but it was pretty rare. So it was, I went out to the balcony and I could hear the sirens. And I thought, well, the only other thing it could be besides rockets was some sort of terrorist infiltration or something. I just thought, who knows what this is? And within moments of thinking that through and still being half asleep, there were interceptions over our heads. So then it was clear, okay, there's a war taking place. There's some sort of a surprise attack. And I went to look online, and I usually report using Arabic media. So I saw that the Hamas had announced this Al-Aqsa flood operation, and that they had called on, a huge uprising to take place, and that they'd fired thousands of rockets already. So I called a friend of mine who was down south in Yerucham, a guy named Dr. Eric Mandel, who comes to Israel often, and he said he was going to go to Sderot. And I said, okay, well, I've covered every other war basically from Sderot or near the border. And that's the best place to be usually. So it's a big city. Sderot, it's like 30,000 people. Yeah, bomb shelters, 30,000 people. There's gas stations and services. So you can always kind of make it a base of operations. So I got in my car and I was going to go there. And even as I was about to leave, I saw in my neighborhood lots of young men and women going to their vehicles to head south because they had already gotten their call-up notices for their reserve units.
Wow.
Or they just spontaneously felt that they should go. So when I drove south, the roads were deserted going south. I mean, it's Shabbat, so they're kind of deserted anyway, but they were more than that. And, the radio was already on. And on the radio, there were people calling in from the kibbutzim or people calling in who knew people there saying, I can't reach my wife. And her phone shows up as if it's in Khan Yunis. can you please help me?
Which
and one guy called in.
Don't know, that's a city, a major city. I've been there with the IDF. It's a major southern city in the Gaza Strip.
Right. So obviously a person's phone shouldn't appear there if they live inside Israel, unless it's been stolen. Or in this case, obviously these people have been kidnapped probably now already. So another guy called in, and he was on a beach called Zikim, which is just north of Gaza. And he said he was hiding in a culvert, and the beach was under attack, and there was shelling everywhere around him. So it was pretty clear how bad this was already and how much chaos was unfolding. And I got down near Sderot, and there was already police checkpoints and cordons, so you couldn't really get into the city. So I drove down to Yad Mordechai, near the border with Gaza, just south of Ashkelon.
Seth, just to continue to paint the picture for our listeners, did you have a bulletproof vest or a flak jacket, a helmet with you?
I had a helmet that I'd had from previous wars, which I guess would protect against shrapnel. It probably doesn't protect against bullets, but it's a helmet. I didn't have a vest, a ceramic vest or anything. Later on, I got one, and I covered the war with the same vest for most of it. But I just didn't have anything.
Yeah. Are you armed?
No, I'm not armed, but I've covered lots of wars. I mean, I covered the Battle of Mosul with the Iraqi army and stuff. So I kind of felt I know this. I look later on. Subsequently, I learned how dangerous it was. I mean, I think driving into the maelstrom, it was not entirely clear what had happened, but I just felt it was important to be there. And we didn't know then, that terrorists had penetrated into Sderot. I mean, we began to understand that, or I did, because Dr. Eric, and as I mentioned in the book, he sent me photos from Sderot showing dead bodies everywhere on the streets. So it was clear that by then this is really, really bad.
Yeah.
And the media and the radio was explaining, how much chaos there was. So we began to kind of piece together a puzzle. But I think the first shocking image in my mind was when I got down to this police cordon just south of Ashkelon near Yad Mordechai, I guess 2 miles from the Gaza border. It didn't feel that there was a war. It was very eerily quiet. There was a few news media and some people milling around, and some army jeeps going by. It didn't feel like a huge emergency, which was strange. But then I saw this car in the middle of the street full of bullet holes, and there was a big bag next to the car. And as I approached it, the bag was actually a dead body that had been covered up, and someone had just put something on top of this body. Apparently it was a terrorist, and they weren't going to evacuate the body because they had so many casualties at that point. Obviously, more than 1,000 dead. That if it was a dead body of a terrorist, that was going to have to wait. It was not the priority in terms of triage.
Right. Continue to walk us through that day, because what you're describing is. There can't be sirens. Okay, there are sirens. Okay, but it can't be that bad. Okay, it's a little bit worse than I thought. Okay, I'm going to head down there. Okay, now I'm hearing, you're picking up intel as you go. Now you're starting to see you're seeing a body, you're seeing a bullet-ridden car. What's going through your mind? Because again, how long have you been an Israeli citizen? You came from the States, of course.
I've lived in Israel for about 20 years. I actually, oddly enough, was on the border of Gaza in 2005 when they first pulled people out in disengagement. So, and I've covered every Gaza war since. I've been on the border on every single conflict. So I know a lot about Gaza, and certainly the Israeli side of it in terms of it. I don't cover the Palestinian side as much, but I know it pretty well. And I feel like that oddly enough, this war is full circle in a sense, because now Israel's going back into something that Israel had worked so hard to leave.
Right. So continue to walk us through what's the mental assessment you're doing. You're a very accomplished journalist. You're also an accomplished analyst of regional affairs. You've covered this stuff. So we say on Passover, why is this night different from all other nights? How are you processing this day is not like anything else that you've ever seen? Keep walking us through those turning points for you.
Sure. So I would say that it's not just October 7th. October 7th was the massive attack. It took, as we know, a bunch of time to pick up the pieces in the days afterward, and then some obvious a lot of time to get the IDF ready to go in, which is all in the book as well. So basically, I would say it's the second day that was really something that transitioned to my understanding of what was happening a bit, because the first day was chaos. But by the time I came back to the same area the next morning, let's say, the terrorists were still inside Israel. There was still fighting going on all throughout the night. And the next day, all the Israeli communities on the border of Gaza, I think we're talking about 29 communities, I don't know, almost 100,000 people or something, were all being evacuated. So I went back to the same area from near Yad Mordechai. There's a few communities like Netiv Asara, Karmia, and Zikim. So these are all little kibbutzim that were all founded back in like the 30s, 40s, and 50s. They form a line along the border. And I think we knew at that point there had been a massacre in Netiv Asara, but I think I was still naive enough to think, well, I should probably try to get in there, to learn about it, to see about, to cover it. I guess I was just thought like this is still something a journalist can cover from right up front, not understanding, of course, that the terrorists were still there among us. And I learned this the hard way. I drove up a road that goes towards the beach, kind of parallel to the border with Gaza, near a kibbutz called Zikim. And I came to a height of land where you can look down and there's an IDF military base kind of a bit below you. There's a beach that's usually very nice to go to, where I'd heard the story of this guy hiding in a culvert the day before. And there's a Jewish kibbutz there. And as I got around the kibbutz, I was on this road, and there was suddenly a big white Savannah van that was still running, and it had military plates on it, black license plates. And the doors were open. Why would the IDF abandon a van with the doors open and leave it running? It was just a totally bizarre, ghostly experience. And I learned later the whole story there, but basically right beyond the van, there were 2 dead bodies of 2 terrorists who had been, they had just been killed. And it turned out that the terrorists had hijacked the van actually the night before. They killed the soldiers that were in it, and they'd gone up to try to attack the kibbutz. And they'd gotten in a gunfight, and all the terrorists mostly had been killed either by people from the kibbutz or there had been naval gunfire as well. And so we came upon that scene. I was with a friend of mine at that point. And it turned out there were still terrorists just a few hundred meters down below us, that 3 or 4 days later, those terrorists ambushed an IDF vehicle with a bunch of elite special forces in it and killed 3 soldiers really close to where we were. So it was clearly a very hairy situation. And I told my friend, I said, this is zombie land. I said, everything around us is just zombie land. We're just in a place we should not be. And so we drove back towards Netiv Asara.
How surreal is that for an Israeli who's done, who's traveled all those areas for 20 plus years?
It was surreal that there didn't feel to be any state around us. There was a breakdown in the state. There was no soldiers, no police. There was nothing seemed to be working that day. I mean, of course, there were some cars in the street. There were some soldiers here and there that we ran into and asked them, well, what can we go here? What should we do? But they had no answers, because for them it was a chaos as well. And we saw all these vehicles along the road that had been shot up. I mean, and we saw bodies of terrorists that I guess had infiltrated, because they say that on that day, 6,000 Palestinians, Gazans entered Israel, of which 3,000 were Hamas killers and fighters, and then there were several thousand of just random civilians. And so we saw the evidence of those people. They had been killed going back or killed going here and there, whatever. So it was just a total chaos. That's why I said Zombieland. It reminded me of just one of these post-apocalyptic movies where a guy wakes up everything's nothing works, that everyone's gone. So right. It was just totally bizarre. I think the first sense that I got that there was a real war taking place, which I'd been waiting to feel like, okay, where's the army? Where's the cavalry? Mm-hmm. Was when we were driving down there, going back from this scene of this van, and we heard tank fire over our head going into Gaza, I guess, or going near it. And it was near a kibbutz called Netiv Asara, where about, I think, more than 10 people had been massacred. And we then understood that there were tanks that had deployed next to us. So we went up to where the tanks were. We went behind them, and we started talking to the reserve officers that were manning them. And one of the reservists got off his tank and said, "This is our 1973 war." And he felt... he just connected deeply with the 73 war, which was like 50 years beforehand. It was the anniversary,
literally, actually. The day, yeah.
Yeah, right. And he was just feeling like, I'm one of the tankists that would have driven up to the Suez Canal. Justice happened on that day, or the first days of the war. It was just a total chaos. But people went to fight, and eventually they turned the tide. And I learned that guy's story later, because I eventually found him again after he'd spent 200 days fighting Hamas. I learned that he'd been called up just like me the next day. He'd gotten up like me, and he decided to join his unit. I went out to cover the war. He went to his tank unit, and they wanted to send him to Gaza in a bus to fight on foot because they didn't know if they could send tanks, or you're not supposed to drive tanks on highways and things because it churns them up because it's treads. So you're supposed to transport them on vehicles, which takes forever. It's very slow. So the tank unit decided to drive to Gaza, and they drove along Kvish 6, the Route 6, which is Israel's big north-south highway. They drove on the side of it, and they had a friend of theirs take a car and drive in front of them so he could show them where to go. And they got to Sderot at like midnight. And he said he only understood how bad the war was when they stopped next to a gas station and people were being evacuated. And he said he described them as having that like 1,000-yard stare, that they just come out of hell. And he understood then what needed to be done. And his tank unit was split in half. 3 or 4 tanks went to Kfar Aza, to the kibbutz, to fight there, and they saved people. And then his unit went to Yad Mordechai, near it, and he sat there with the guys, and they did protect that area. And then 2.5 weeks later, he was the first one. His tank was the first lead element to go into Gaza, to go towards south towards Shati, and then eventually to cut off Gaza City from the around near the beach. So he had this formative story, which I told in the book, about being the kind of just there from the very beginning.
I appreciate that. We only have a few more minutes with you, and I appreciate your time because I know you got a lot going on. And is there one other story that sort of captures your sense of how bad October 7th itself was, or how it's reshaping Israeli society? Just draw out a couple other, 1 or 2 other nuggets that ought to persuade people this is a book I got to read.
Well, I think another part of this story, I tried to cover the human element, the IDF soldiers, the civilians, what people did for the first few months of the war, primarily focusing on the soldiers' experience. But, I also cover a little bit of the Northern Front, the Hezbollah attacks on Israel, and also, touch on the attacks on Israel from the Houthis in Yemen. And, this October 7th war, it's a terrible massacre. It's the worst genocide of the Jewish people since the Holocaust. It's going to reshape, Israel for generations. But it's reshaping the whole world order, because October 7th is a first shot, or one shot, in the new world order of what Russia and China and Turkey and Iran and enemies of the West, what they are trying to do. And Hamas is part of that. But it was told, or it worked with Iran to fire this shot, this genocidal attack, which they thought would change the world. And they're kind of right, in the sense that after October 7th, all of these Iranian-backed groups have been attacking Israel in like a ring of fire. And Israel's fending them all off. But, Israel's not alone. I mean, there's a war going on in Ukraine. There's trouble with China in the Pacific Ocean. This is part of a much bigger story. And I'm a historian. I really like history. I think of this like the shot that started the First World War. They killed Archduke Franz Ferdinand down there in Sarajevo. This set off a weird chain of events that led to the First World War, which no one would have thought at the time. Like, why would Austria-Hungary invading Serbia start a world war? I mean, why would that happen? So I just believe that this is something that is so much bigger than ourselves. And I wanted to tell this as that through the humanize it. But I also just believe through those stories, we can understand that our world that we're living in and the global world order is being reshaped, right in front of us. It's like 1775 at Concord and Lexington, when the first shots were fired in the Revolutionary War, which set America on a course to today. These are little things that happen. I mean, the Battle of Concord or Lexington, this is just a few hundred guys or something. It's very small. But imagine where it's led. So I just think it's important to think of it like that.
Seth, thank you so much. I'm going to continue. I want to tell our listeners that when we come back from the break, I want to do some analysis of Seth's book and our conversation and some of the other things I'm picking up this week, talking to a number of other journalists and firsthand observers of this war. But Seth Frantzman, thank you so much. Again, the book is The October 7th War, Israel's Battle for Security in Gaza. People can find that on Amazon and other links. Seth Frantzman, Frantzman. He's a long time and very excellent and seasoned reporter for the Jerusalem Post. And I've gotten to not only get to know you here in Israel, but we've spent time in the Gulf trying to analyze that general sense that peace was breaking out in recent years. And I think the October 6th mood in Israel generally, but certainly in the prime minister's office was, we're about to make peace with the Saudis. The world has changed. It's changed in Israel's favor. And we got blindsided by an evil we just did not see coming, but should have. And I appreciate your reporting. And it's an important book. And I encourage everyone to pick it up, not just for themselves, share it with others, get copies for others, because understanding what happened that day and what's happened since is critical. And to do it from someone who's a firsthand reporter, one of the only 3 English language books that there are, is critical, because basically from much of the rest of the media, you're not getting the real story, but you will from Seth Frantzman. Seth, thank you for your friendship. Thank you for coming on the Inside the Epicenter podcast. Appreciate it. Welcome back to the Inside the Epicenter podcast. I'm Joel Rosenberg, founder and chairman of the Joshua Fund. Such an interesting conversation with my friend Seth Frantzman, seasoned and senior correspondent for the Jerusalem Post, has covered all of the Arab-Israeli wars over the last 20 years, particularly in and around Gaza. And his new book is very, very important. There's more I want to get into, because I want to play audio from an interview I just did with the author of another of the 3 English language books that are about October 7th that have just come out or just coming out. But first, let me share with you the verse that is on my heart today. And that's from Romans chapter 12, verse 15. Again, Romans chapter 12, verse 15. Rejoice with those who rejoice, and weep with those who weep. We are living in a season in Israel over the past year of needing to really understand that verse more than ever. There hasn't been a lot to rejoice over. Mostly we've been weeping with those who weep. And what that means is to have a heart of compassion, to understand the grief, the profound, soul-shattering grief that so many Israelis are going through, so many Palestinians are going through, so many Lebanese are going through. To understand that grief, to identify with it, is important, because the Bible urges us, encourages us, that the way to love people is to understand where they're coming from. Now, you may not agree with them theologically, politically, or in all kinds of other ways, but ideologically, whatever. But to identify with their emotions, identify with their grieving, if that's what they're going through, is important. Because otherwise we're a callous people. And Christians are never supposed to be callous. Our hearts are never supposed to be cold. And so we need to understand how to identify with people who have lost everything and don't know the love of Jesus Christ. They don't have eternal security. They don't have what the Apostle Paul called a supernatural peace that passes all comprehension, a peace that passes all understanding. That's what the Bible promises. That's what the New Testament promises. That's what Jesus and the apostles promise through the power of the Holy Spirit. But if you don't know that, if you're not adopted into God's family, how are you going to experience that? Or even know that this is valuable, even though it's something that you're longing for, finding peace in a troubled world, peace where it's incomprehensible, meaning not that the world has changed around you, maybe it's still horrible, but that you find peace. And this is what Jesus is talking about. This is what the Apostle Paul is talking about. And that's what we need to both understand and then practice and have a compassion for those around us. Now, there's also the rejoicing with those who rejoice. One of the things that we did a podcast just recently, right, with my Lindsay, my friend and colleague, Tal Heinrich, who was a senior correspondent for All Israel News. She was my senior producer for the Rosenberg Report on TBN. And then she got called up on October 7th by the Prime Minister's office. And the Prime Minister said, you're going to work for me and be one of my spokeswomen. And I'm putting you on a plane and you're going to be here tomorrow and then you're going to start. And so her whole life changed. And yet she's also gotten married. And she's also expecting a baby. And so we don't want to just wallow in grief, weeping with those who weep, although that's an important part of the Christian life. We also want to be able to rejoice with those who are rejoicing. And that's a complicated set of emotions in it. And Israelis are going through that complicated set of emotions all this year. So that's why I want to draw that Romans 12:15 passage, because what Seth describes in his book about the October 7th war is a nation that's been knocked out of our comfort zone. We are being shaken. I've talked to you on this podcast before about we're in an Amos 9 verse 9 moment. What is Amos 9:9? It's when God says prophetically, I will, meaning in the future, I will shake the whole house of Israel among the nations. And I believe he's done that multiple times over the years since the Hebrew prophet Amos wrote that. But we're definitely in a moment where all Israel is being shaken right now, and all the nations are watching. Some nations are sympathetic, and some nations are very hostile towards us. So Seth's book really does a very interesting job capturing that. And so I wanted to draw that attention. So in terms of prayer requests, please keep praying for those who are mourning. Israelis, Palestinians, Lebanese. Many are innocent civilians who did not ask for this war, do not want this war, but are powerless to stop it. But it is affecting us. It is affecting them. And we need to be praying for them, for God to heal. And it's going to take supernatural healing. We mentioned on a recent podcast, Lynn said that Joshua Fund's helping fund biblical Christian counseling for those who are believers or unbelievers who need personal counseling. That's good, but the whole country needs counseling. I mean, it's that bad right now. And that's just the Israelis. And then you got the Lebanese and the Palestinians and others. So please keep praying for that supernatural healing and for the church to know how to respond to the emotional and spiritual and psychological trauma that this whole country and region is going through. Please continue to pray that the Joshua Fund specifically would know how to wisely invest the funds that you and others are donating graciously and so generously. We want to be good stewards of those funds. We want to put them to good use, both to strengthen the local church, make sure that other people hear the good news of the Lord, that they understand a way to read the Bible and process, but also humanitarian relief, food, clothing, medical supplies, and so forth. And of course, education. Inside the Epicenter podcast is part of the educational mission of the Joshua Fund, educating Christians what is happening in this part of the world. Why does it matter? How do we look at it through a biblical worldview lens? How should we be moved by compassion to make a difference? That's part of the educational ministry of the Joshua Fund. And this podcast costs money. So we appreciate those of you who want to give a tax-deductible donation if you're an American or Canadian. If you're giving from other parts of the world, of course, you can give online at joshuafund.com. Again, joshuafund.com. Wherever you are, I'm just saying, you do get a tax deduction if you do it in the United States. And there's a specific way to do it if you're Canadian, and that's all on the joshuafund.com donate page. So those are some of the prayer requests for today. In this part of the podcast, I want to play some audio from an interview I just did with one of the other journalists, in this case, Israeli journalists, who has written a book about October 7th. It's called The Gates of Gaza. And again, we're going to have links to both Seth's book and the book by Amir Tibon, The Gates of Gaza. There'll be links to both books in the show notes. So please check that out. But let me give it a little context before we get into the audio clip. And the clip runs about 8 minutes. So Amir Tibon is, like Seth, a very seasoned Israeli journalist. Now, Seth works for the Jerusalem Post, which is generally considered centrist or maybe center-right in its general outlook politically. Amir Tibon works for Haaretz, which is considered left of center. By some would be considered particularly left of center, but is one of the oldest newspapers in Israel, as is the Jerusalem Post. Both very well respected, but the Jerusalem Post is sort of the main English newspaper that people on the center right focus on if they're looking for an English paper. Haaretz is published both in Hebrew and in English. And it is considered maybe maybe the New York Times, let's say, of anyone on the center left. These are not the only two news sources, but I wanted to give you a little picture of two different journalists, two different books, both very important. And so Amir is a journalist, but Amir is also a resident of the closest Israeli community to the Gaza border. It's a little agricultural community known as a kibbutz called Nahal Oz. And Amir and his wife Miri and their two little daughters, 3.5-year-old daughter is one, a year and a half is the other. They lived in a little house on this little community of only about 400 people right on the Gaza border. I mean, literally, you can see the fence from their yard. And I know that because this week, as I record this, I'm recording this on a Friday. On a Tuesday, I was in Nahal Oz with Amir in his home, interviewing him about his new book that's just about to come out, The Gates of Gaza. And I was not just interviewing Amir, but also his father, Noam Tibon. Very quick, I don't want to give it all away, but I want to give you a sense of why you should also read that book. Because Amir and his wife woke up to the sounds of, they didn't have sirens, right? Seth woke up to the sound of sirens in Jerusalem. Amir and Miri woke up to the sounds of a mortar incoming and blew up right near their home. And then more and more and more and rockets. Their community is so close to the border, they don't get sirens. They don't get a warning because there's not enough time for mortars or rockets to make enough of a ballistic arc that Israeli technology can track it and give a warning in time. Israelis who live in this particular community with Amir and Miri and his wife and their kids, they hear the whistle of it inbound and the explosion. So this is what they wake up to around 6:30 in the morning on the morning of that Saturday, October 7th, and they race from their bedroom into their bomb shelter. Now, their bomb shelter, their safe room, which is known in Hebrew as a mamad, that actually is where they put their children. That's where the children live, in little beds in that room. Why? Because there have been so many attacks over the years on this community and all the communities along the Gaza border that there's no point in parents jumping up from their room, going to the children's bedroom, then gathering up the children, and then getting to the bomb shelter. It takes too long. And you do not have that amount of time. So the parents race to the children's room. They're not even awake yet, and they lock the door. But when they locked that door, 10 hours went by. For 10 hours, they were in that bomb shelter safe room as the rocket explosions got worse and the mortars explosions got worse. And then they heard automatic gunfire. And then they hear the voices of Hamas terrorists in Arabic right outside their house. Amir knows enough Arabic to know that these were terrorist leaders giving tactical instructions. You go and invade that house. You slaughter those people. You go in that house. I'll go in this house. And that terrorist was talking about Amir's house. And I was just in that house. And it's pretty moving to be with him, to see the bullet holes in their windows as Hamas terrorists were shooting AK-47s through their windows, hoping to kill somebody who might just be out, in the living room, in the kitchen. But fortunately, Amir and his wife and children are safe in the safe room unless these terrorists break in. On the Rosenberg report, I'm going to do, a big story. I did a story actually about a year ago with Amir, but this time I interviewed him and his father. And it's the first interview that he's given, that they've given, and it's the only interview they're going to give on American television together. The reason that's important is because Amir is a journalist and a resident of Nahal Oz, but his father is a former retired, very senior IDF general. Retired, 66 years old. He and his wife are swimming on October 7th. They'd gone out for an early swim in the Mediterranean, just outside of Tel Aviv. They see the rockets. They hear the sirens. They grab their towels, clean up, get in their car, go to their house, and they start getting text messages and calls from Amir saying, "We've been invaded." And Noam Tibon, the father, tells his wife, "We're going to save our kids and our grandkids." And so he grabs his 9mm pistol. They jump in their Jeep Wrangler and they start heading south. And the story of the gun battles that erupt on their way, that Noam, as a father and a former, high-ranking IDF general, has to get involved in just to get to the community to rescue his kids is astonishing. I mean, literally, this book is a must-read, The Gates of Gaza. And then to interview the two of them together, I only interviewed Amir before, and that was just a few weeks after it happened. Now, as the book is about to come out, The Gates of Gaza, they were very gracious to invite me to Amir's home and to interview both of them. It's going to be a super interesting program on the Rosenberg Report coming up very soon on the October 7th week, Lord willing, that anniversary. I want to share with you then a portion of audio because I asked him what Amir, do you want evangelicals to know in this moment? And his heart is mostly focused in this part of the interview, in this 8 minutes for our podcast, on the pain that he's dealing with in terms of the hostages, right? 6 Israeli hostages were just murdered. Yes, 1 Israeli hostage was just rescued, but just that same day or maybe the next day, 6 Israeli hostages were murdered. And there's a big fight going on inside the Israeli cabinet right now over should Israel strike a deal with Hamas immediately to get at least some of these hostages out, or is the price that Hamas is asking too high? And Amir is appealing in my conversation with him to evangelical Christians to understand why so many Israelis are saying, look, we can always fully defeat Hamas later, but right now we've got to get whatever hostages are still alive, get them out. We believe there are about 105 hostages left in Gaza. The rest are either have come out in a deal that Netanyahu was able to negotiate back in November, or the others have been killed. And there were about 251 hostages at the beginning. So now we're at 105, but only around 60 to 65 of those hostages are believed to still be alive. So time is running out. Every hostage that has been rescued talks about their torture, about their rape, about the starvation that they dealt with, the loneliness, the depression, the nightmares, the inability to breathe well in those terror tunnels and so forth. And so there's enormous pressure on Netanyahu and the government. Look, make a deal. And yet others Israelis are saying, no, that the price is too high. And the others are like, pay it. We've got to get these people out. That's our moral obligation. So you're going to hear Amir share his perspective. His perspective is, I mean, he doesn't believe Israel should give away the store, but he does believe that this is the moment. And I just want to note that it's not just a left-right battle. It's not like, well, Netanyahu on the center-right believes, no, the price is too high, and that all of his opponents on the left-wing side of Israel are saying, oh, no, you have to make the deal now. It's not that. Netanyahu's own defense minister, Yoav Gallant, is saying it's time to make a deal. Yes, there's some costs. I wish we didn't have to pay them, but it's time to make a deal. It's time to get as many hostages out as we can. And Netanyahu and Gallant have had screaming matches in the Israeli cabinet room. Now, it's illegal for people in that cabinet room to tell anyone outside the cabinet room what happened, but there have been a number of leaks. And there have been I've talked to a number of journalists who have confirmed that this is exactly what happened. There was a knockdown, drag out, screaming match between the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, and Netanyahu's hand-picked, appointed defense minister, Yoav Gallant. They're the same party, the same political philosophy, but they see the situation entirely differently. And so I just want to give you that context, because as you hear Amir, he's going to appeal to evangelicals. Look, understand why we think that there's the need to get the hostages out now. And he even appeals to former President Trump to play a role in calling for Netanyahu to make a deal now. It's a big divide inside Israel right now. But let's take a moment, and let's take the next 8 minutes or so, and let's listen to Israeli journalist and October 7th survivor, Amir Tibon, author of the forthcoming book, The Gates of Gaza. Let's listen to my just a segment, a snippet of my conversation. Amir, thank you so much for letting me come to your home and talk about these issues. What's your message to evangelicals? We're almost a year in. These hostages, we got 101 still. We're not sure if they're all alive, but what's your message to evangelicals? What should we be thinking and praying about right now?
I think that for evangelicals and people around the world who love the state of Israel, the most important priority right now should be, how do we bring back the hostages? It's important to understand, Joel, this is not just a humanitarian issue. It is a national security issue for the state of Israel right now. If we don't bring back these people from Gaza and we let them die suffering in the tunnels, it will tear apart Israeli society. It will cause a rift in our society 10 times larger than the rift we experienced before October 7, which played some part in Hamas's decision to attack us because they saw we were divided and weak and used the opportunity.
Okay, Netanyahu in his press conference last night says, look, I'm ready to make a deal. Nobody wants to make a deal more than me, but we cannot, under any circumstances, give up the Philadelphia line or corridor because this is their oxygen line, this is their supply line, and if we leave, people can say, the army can tell me, we'll go back. But did we go back when we evacuated in 2005? No, it took 20 years almost.
Who was the prime minister for 15 of those 20 years, Joe? This is the problem here, because he had every opportunity, if he wanted, to detach Hamas from the Philadelphia corridor. He didn't do it in the 2012 war when he was prime minister. He didn't do it in the 2014 war when he was prime minister. He didn't do it in any of the operations against Hamas that we fought during his time in office. And even in this war, it took him 8 months to give the military the order to take over the Philadelphia corridor, which could have been done on day one of the war. And
your point being, I just want to make sure I'm understanding it, meaning it's important, but it's not the most important. Otherwise, it would have been dealt with
First
sooner
of all,
and decisively.
If this was such the most important thing in the world, it should have been done years earlier. But of course, it's not. It's important, but when you look at the strategic picture, holding on to Philadelphia right now, if it means no hostage deal, it means three things. Number one, the hostages die suffering in the tunnels, and Israeli society is torn apart, and the foundations of the state of Israel, the moral foundations of this country, collapse. This is a huge national security risk, much larger than anything associated with not controlling Philadelphia, which includes risk. I'm not downplaying it, but the risk of the moral and societal collapse that we will experience if these people who were abducted from their beds, if these brave female soldiers, the intelligence spotters who warned about the war and then were kidnapped, if they die suffering in the tunnels, this is a national security risk to our country. This will cause, I don't want to say irreparable, but terrible damage to Israeli society and to Israeli resilience. That's point number one. Point number two, our soldiers will be sitting ducks there. The Philadelphia corridor is not the Mississippi River. It's a very, very narrow strip of border where you have hostile people on one side, Hamas and the local population that hates you, and semi-hostile people on the other side. A lot of, it's the Sinai, it's under control of Egypt, but there are gangs there and all kinds of armed groups. Our soldiers will become sitting ducks if they just sit there in outposts and look over the border.
Okay. And
point number three, we will not have enough forces to start taking care of the north. The Israeli border with Lebanon has been empty for a year now. Hezbollah is firing at our communities every day. And we are basically stuck in a situation where, because we are not closing the deal in Gaza, we cannot shift our focus to the bigger enemy, which is Hezbollah and Iran. Those are the three main reasons why we have to do it now. We want to save the hostages and with them save Israeli society from a terrible collapse and crisis. We want to have a situation where we can attack Hamas along the Philadelphia corridor, go in and out like we do in Jenin, like we do in Nablus, but don't have static forces that are just sitting there waiting to be shot at by snipers. And we want to focus our forces on the bigger story in the north.
Okay, two quick last questions. You know Hirsch's family. You were actually talking to Hirsch's father on the night, Saturday night, when the news started to break.
A few hours before they got the terrible news.
And you didn't even believe when you heard the news because you're like, I just talked to his father. His father didn't say anything. How are they doing?
I actually got a message from his sister and his father a short time ago, and thanking me for something I wrote about this special, powerful, incredible family. And I want to talk to Americans now, of all political stripes and of all religions, Republicans and Democrats, evangelicals and Jews and others. If you want to really honor Hirsch Goldberg and his family, listen to his parents, because his parents are not asking to hold on to Philadelphia at all costs, and they're not asking to kill the last Hamasnik in Gaza, even though Hamasniks all deserve to die. But what his parents are asking for is to make a hostage deal and save the people like Hirsch who can still be saved. And this is the legacy that we can push for in order to honor him. And it's not a political issue.
And he was on the list. He would have been out in this first wave.
He could have been saved. We need to save the others. We need to push for a deal. We need to put all partisan politics aside. This is not going to be a Biden deal, and it's not going to be a Trump deal. And it has to be something that both Republicans and Democrats can agree on.
Okay, so let me ask you on the my last question then, is you just mentioned former President Trump. Is there a role that you think, a positive role that he could play in this at this moment? I mean, obviously Biden wants a deal and he's pushing for it.
I think it would be incredibly powerful if we heard both President Biden and President Trump saying, let's do this deal now. Let's get these people alive now. And President Trump has said that some of the hostages are being killed by Hamas. He wasn't wrong. We just saw that happen. Let's push for a deal now. Republicans and Democrats. And also push Netanyahu a little bit. Yes, we need to push Hamas, we need to push Qatar, we need to push Egypt. Apparently, we also have to push the Israeli government on this issue.
And you're not calling for an end to the war, but you're saying make a deal that provides a temporary a pause
we first of all
all the hostages
we need
a
temporary pause to start the deal. And in order to complete it, we may have to end the war, and Israel will have to search for the next opportunity to fight with our enemies in Hamas. But we have to remember, Joel, if we stop in Gaza right now, we still have a problem with Iran, we still have a problem with Hezbollah. We're going to be fighting for years right now. If we wait until the very end of the war, we will have no hostages left to bring out.
Amir, thank you. Thank you. God bless you. We're praying for you and all the hostages. Okay, so you hear how strongly he feels that this is the moment. And I want to tell you that the polls have come out in recent days. There's two that show the society deeply divided. Jewish Israelis are pretty much, like 45-45, 47-44, like super divided between Netanyahu's position and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant's position. But I wanted you to hear directly from one of these authors and again, an October 7th survivor. I encourage you to buy both of these books. I don't make any money from them, so there's no kickback here. I just know these two men, Seth Frantzman and Amir Tibon, are excellent journalists. They're both Jewish. They don't believe in Jesus. They're not evangelicals, but I think part of the reason I built a good relationship with them is because they're intrigued with how evangelicals think, why evangelicals love Israel so much, and they have believed from their own different ideological, philosophical, political, religious, actually they're fairly secular themselves, but from their own background, they are intrigued with evangelicals. They've interviewed me numerous times to try to understand the evangelical perspective better. And I am intrigued with them. I think they're excellent journalists. You're not going to agree with everything you read in these two books. I'm not saying that, but they're two fine books. I will tell you the other book that I encourage you to read, and in this case, I don't usually do this because this is not a book club, but I would encourage you to work your way through each of them. There's three. So I would, if it were me, well, this actually is the way I've done it. So I would start with Amir Tibon's The Gates of Gaza, because it's the only book in English, it's the only book by an Israeli survivor of October 7th. He is a journalist, but he's also a participant. He's a survivor. And the story of his father coming and his mother coming to rescue him and the gunfights that the father had to get into that almost cost his own life multiple times is amazing. Just astonishing. And I wept my way through that book. So I would start with The Gates of Gaza by Amir Tibon. I would then read Seth's book. Seth's book is less emotional, but it's still super interesting because you've got an Israeli journalist from the center right looking at these the October 7th itself and what happens again with Lebanon, with Iran, and Seth is a remarkable analyst, a geopolitical analyst, and so that book is a little bit more big picture as well as granular, and I think that's excellent. Then the third book is by a friend of mine named Trey Yinx. Trey is the chief foreign correspondent for Fox News. And literally the morning that I am recording this interview, I just spent an hour with Trey interviewing Trey about his book called Black Saturday. Okay, Black Saturday, the story of October 7th. And he has a totally different way of writing the book, it's also first person as a reporter. But unlike two Israeli journalists who don't really have sources inside Hamas, Trey Yinx does. So Trey, you're gonna hear his interactions and conversations and interviews with Hamas leaders. You're also going to get from Trey Yinx's book, Black Saturday, the only book of the three that has exclusive interviews with Israel's defense minister, Yoav Gallant, laying out the military strategy, talking about the night that Israel did start the invasion of Gaza and a number of other key moments, including some of the battles that Gallant has had with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. So it's interesting that in this week, I've interviewed all three of these, they're not only friends, but they're all three journalists, two Israelis, one American, the only books out there on October 7th. And I would work your way through all of them and give them as gifts as well. Well, thank you so much for listening to this edition of Inside the Epicenter. I hope these things are helpful. I hope you will be praying for the release of these hostages and that Israel doesn't have to give up too much. We certainly don't want to surrender to Hamas, but pray for Israelis on the northern border as well, because the fighting up there just keeps getting worse and worse. And there's no end in sight at this point for these wars, this overall war on multiple fronts. We are fighting, and it's just not clear how this thing ends. I wish I had better news. But thank you so much for listening. Please, rate this highly. Please be sure to subscribe to this podcast. Encourage other people to subscribe as well. Share a link to this podcast with your friends and family on social media. Encourage them to listen to Inside the Epicenter. Let them know it's a source of information about what's happening in Israel and the Arab Muslim world that you trust from evangelical Christians with a biblical world view. Again, you can learn more about each of those three authors and links to each of the three books in our show notes. So please check that out. Please go to joshuafund.com. Again, joshuafund.com to learn more about the Joshua Fund ministry and to make a generous gift, financial gift to the ministry. The needs are just enormous and growing. We're so grateful for your kindness, your generosity, your humility in giving. And we appreciate the trust that you have given us to deploy your resources to care for the poor and needy, educate the church, strengthen the church, and to be a witness for the Lord here in this very dark and troubled region. So you can go and you can give at joshuafund.com. On behalf of the entire team here, thank you so much for listening to Inside the Epicenter. I'm Joel Rosenberg, founder and chairman of the Joshua Fund. Thank you. God bless you. And keep praying for the peace of Jerusalem. Hey, I'm Joel Rosenberg. On your left, you'll find some videos we've chosen specifically for you. We look forward to partnering with you to bless Israel and her neighbors in the name of Jesus.